as foreign liquidity began to dry up, exposing the weakness in Ghana's economic fundamentals. The only option was for Ghana to turn to the IMF for a bailout package. Professor Bopin sounded the alarm bells. He said going to the IMF was inescapable.
I personally don't think that the IMF is a long-term solution to our problems. And the reason I say so is that we've been there 16, 17 times. Is that okay? And practically every 3 years and some few months, we've had to go to the IMF and all of that. But as we always say, what takes us to the IMF has to do with the fundamentals. And as we sit right now, everything points to that.
The calls to register for an IMF bailout became intense.
After seeing Article 4, after seeing the COVID report, Article 4 2019 and the COVID report, and seeing the fiscal gap which is there, that was when I expressed the view that maybe it's time for us to go, that's how far back, to go to the fund, because it's not just about COVID. But we got all the COVID money, as I said already, and we could have used it to make a correction. Because the COVID money we got for ECF was 913 or so, million US dollars. Here you're talking about 6 billion. Why was it not sufficient to do the correction? Something fundamentally wrong.
Government's position was very simple. No IMF program. It has so much hope in using domestic means to turn the nation's economic fortunes around.
We are not going to the IMF. Whatever we do, we are not. The consequences are there. We are a proud nation. We have the resources. We have the capacity. Don't let anybody tell you.
In the raging storm, Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta was insistent that government wouldn't subscribe to an IMF program.
If because of political pride and the rest of them we don't want to go, that is a different thing altogether. It should not be our first resort. But we have not demonstrated that on our own we'll be able to impose a fiscal consolidation that would elicit the appropriate response from duty bearers, as perhaps we have seen in our relationship with the fund. If we could do that, why not? For 60-something years of independence, we can't keep going to the IMF. Anytime we go to the IMF, I feel that I feel we've lost something, right, as a sovereign country and the rest of them. But IMF doesn't impose itself on any country. Through countries' own actions and inactions, mismanagement of the economy and the rest of them takes them to the IMF. So if we arrive at that point where homegrown solution has probably failed to get at the same result, we'll do that. I believe that in 2014, when the government made a call to the IMF, it wasn't because it was their first resort, right? Yeah, the fundamentals dictate so.
My position has always been, once the government, on our behalf, whether I like it or not, says we are not going to the IMF, then my position changed. Then show as an alternative.
IMF cannot save us, right? Because we've done IMF 16 times, getting to 17 times now. We were on an IMF program for the best part of this government until recently, right? Up to the end of 2018, this government was on an IMF program. The good thing, though, in that respect, is that it does show that being an IMF program imposes more discipline. Because this government itself argues that all the way until early 2019, they were doing brilliant. What that means is that they were doing brilliant during the IMF program. That's an important point. So to make the case as if IMF is a problem is strange. If you did IMF from 2017 all the way to end of December 2018, and the economy was doing well as per your own analysis, then what is the argument anymore about IMF being a poison or a toxic element that you need to avoid? The government's attitude tends to be that, oh, we don't need IMF because IMF is bad. In a way, they don't say it directly, but it implies that it's bad. And I'm arguing that from 2017 January, when they came into power, to 2018 December, that's 2 years, they were running an IMF program. Now, when you ask them about their financial track record and their performance, the government likes to say that until COVID hit, we're doing brilliant. And I'm saying that if that track record is one you are so proud of, you did that under an IMF program.
Despite government's insistence, the honorary vice president of Imani Africa, Bright Simmons, was hopeful government's best bet was seeking an IMF support. But beyond the political ego, was there any historical experience preventing government from approaching the IMF for liquidity support?
During 2018, when you were under an IMF program, you were growing at 8.3%, right? You were doing fantastically well on inflation. Exchange rate was stable, right? We did not see massive unemployment based on some IMF restrictions or whatever it is that you've been calling it. You did the IMF program for 2 years. We know these are some of the reasons why you don't like the IMF. In April 2018, the government was forced to acknowledge that it lied to the IMF about its external arrests and was forced to apologize, right? You have to write to the managing director of the IMF and apologize that somehow you forgot whatever, some data was not there, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that is why you don't like the IMF, because that extra discipline, that extra scrutiny may not be something that is to your liking, but we have to look beyond your ego and think about a country. Yes, the IMF will insist that you disclose the data. You will not be able to play the games that you play with us here, where you say something, where is the data, you refuse to disclose the data. They will insist. So that might not be very pleasant for managers in the government, but that does not mean that it's against the national interest. We should distinguish between IMF program elements that may not benefit Ghana, of which nowadays there are not that many because you yourself have to come up with a proposal and you yourself have to negotiate it. And then IMF program elements that may not benefit the government, ministers and officials that may be responsible for designing and implementing it. I think the two are not on the same scale. And while the IMF will not transform Ghana, while the IMF will not change Ghana's fortunes dramatically, our argument is that it's no worse from the things that's already happening.
Thank you for staying with us. We get into our big stories now, and of course you know that we're focusing on our economic trajectory, how we ended up here knocking on the door of the IMF. It has opened up to us, but what are the elements that brought us here and what is the way forward? A Nation That Begs is our latest Hotline documentary, and in this second installment, parts of which you saw, snippets of which we just showed you, we've titled it Hero to Zero. Joining us for a conversation on why we've fallen from grace to grass, Dr. Priscilla Twumasi Baffour. She's a senior lecturer, Department of Economics at the University of Ghana. We also have Dr. Richmond Etuahene. He is a banking consultant. Also on board this morning, Dr. Theo Echampong is an economist and risk analyst. And we also have Professor Baffour Agyeman-Duah, former UN Senior Governance Advisor. Gentlemen, so far, those that I can see, at least Prof. Dr. Theo Echampong, a very good morning to you both.
Morning. Good morning. And thanks for having me here.
Thanks for joining us. We're grateful. We're grateful that every time we call you gentlemen, busy as you are, you take the time to join us. I see Dr. Priscilla Twumasi Baffour as well. A very good morning to you, madam. Hello, Doc? Doc, can you hear me? Dr. Priscilla?
Yes, I can. Good morning. Yes, I can hear you.
Great. It's good to have you. So just to kickstart the conversation, I'll give each one of you a bite of just very brief bites, less than a minute, and then I'll focus on Dr. Priscilla Twumasi Baffour because she has to run a little early this morning. So I'll give her ample time, gentlemen, to expand on her thoughts before she takes leave of us. Then the rest of us will delve deep into the conversation. So initial thoughts on why we've ended up here time without number, the rhetoric that has not been backed by action, and what you're seeing currently. Watchers of our economy say we're doing the same old things we've always done, and that another IMF program after this one is a likelihood. What are your thoughts on these? I'll start with you, Dr. Priscilla Twumasi Baffour.
Thank you very much, and good morning once again to my fellow panelists and your listeners, viewers. Essentially, when you look at the trajectory of Ghana's economy not much really is changing in terms of tracking it from a historical perspective. Why am I saying yes? There is evidence that there's structural transformation, but this structural transformation, which is should be coupled with a lot of productive activity, we do not find that. You see that the structural transformation is service-led, and most of the service-led activities are also informal in nature. So essentially, the structure has changed from agricultural dependence into service-led. But in terms of the formality or informality of the economy, it hasn't changed much. Over 80% of the Ghanaian economy is still largely informal. And so when you look at, for example, where people work, you find that 12% of the labor force work in the public sector, about 16% work in the private sector. The rest are in the informal sector. The challenge with the informal sector is that it is very difficult to tax the informal sector, particularly when it comes to direct taxes. So in that regard, you find that our tax revenue in terms of personal income taxes are very low. We are not able to cover. If my memory serves me right, I think the people who pay income taxes would be about less than 1.5 million out of the whole labor force of almost 10 million. And so essentially that, why am I emphasizing so much on this? We are looking at the struggle for the country to generate enough revenue. And here, the revenue we are looking at, tax revenue. And then when you come to, what do we call it, in terms of our resources, you see that most of the agreements we've signed are not too favorable to the Ghanaian economy in the sense that we do not generate much. The reason being that you see that a lot of the times there's a huge investment outlay that is expected to exploit these resources. So usually as a developing country wanting to attract foreign interest, would usually give them very favorable deals. But the question is, these deals, these agreements keep expiring and we renew them consistently. So why have we as a country not made a lot of changes so that the country stands to gain from its mineral resources? And bear in mind, these mineral resources are not renewable. And so essentially, I mean, in this day and age of climate change as well, you find that it comes with a lot of hazardous environmental impact, and the society suffers. We do not get much. And essentially, you find that revenue is a problem. Then when you come to the expenditure side, we are also dealing with a situation where now our politicians come out with a lot of promises. So the electorates are also in anticipation, constantly in need and demanding the promises that have been rolled out before elections. And so government is compelled to spend. And even with the expenditure, given that we are not generating enough resources, that you do not find a lot of prudence as well in terms of the expenditure side. Why am I saying you find a lot of government uncompleted projects that have been left for years and for monies to go waste? And sometimes you ask yourself, if these were private entities, I don't think that the resources would have been managed that way. And so in short, we are struggling to generate revenue. On the other hand, expenditure, we are not too prudent with it. And so consistently, governments run budget deficits. And so the budget deficit needs to be financed. How have we financed these budget deficits over the years? Certainly through borrowing. And borrowing, we would borrow either from the domestic market or from the external market. In recent times, external borrowing had become a very important source of foreign currency inflows, and as much as a very important support for our budgets. But you see that external sources also come with its issues, particularly commercial loans, because that is where credit agencies would come in. I see that the president is not too happy about rating agencies, but certainly that is their job. If you open up your economy to the market, you are susceptible to speculations on the market. So the responsibility is on you to keep your fundamentals right so that you would always have some good ratings to continue to have access to the market. And so Ghana was locked out of the international capital market. And based on all the shocks we've gone through, we find that the system could not hold.
Right.
And so essentially, we had to go back to the IMF again for another 17th program. And so when you look at it in terms of our journey on with IMF and all that, you also find that most of the times we get the program, the resources come in, we start right by keeping fiscal discipline and all that. But then you find that structural reforms that we are expected to get to work to change the pattern, the nature of the economy, our level of import dependence, the fact that we are still so reliant on export of primary commodities. We do not get to work in those programs. And essentially, I must also indicate that working for structural reforms also takes time. And then sometimes you find that politicians are quick to salvage quick gains that have been made. And so nobody pays a lot of attention to these structural reforms. So you find that the slightest shock after the program, then we are back again on our knees.
Thank you for those initial comments. Let me quickly bring in Dr. Theo Echampong. What would be your response to say, as Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo has enumerated, she spoke about taxes, our tax system, and how it's not necessarily serving our purpose. We'll be delving into the bit about taxes a lot more later on. We're talking about projects that remain uncompleted. We're talking about structural reforms and all of that. But for you, why do we keep ending at the doorstep of the IMF, Doc?
Good morning. Pleasure to be here. And I largely side with a number of the points that Priscilla has made. In fact, I've actually got a book here that the title is The Economy of Ghana 60 Years After Independence, right? And this was edited by Professor Ernest Aite and Ravi. And in fact, a lot of the things we're discussing, the solutions are actually here without talking too much, right? Because if you take your time to study the Ghanaian economy and all that has happened over the period, fundamentally, for me, it comes down to two things. The fact that the export base of the economy has barely changed in the last 70 or 60 years. You still got gold, you still got cocoa, and most recently we've got oil, but we're not really doing much in terms of adding value. And that's the point that Priscilla started with. Then on top of that, we've also got these external factors, so to say, right? So you can have these commodity price shocks, and it can be positive or negative if they go up or if they come down. You also got the financial shocks. So in the sense that Ghana's economy increasingly has become much more integrated with what happens with the broader global economy. And anytime you have issues such as COVID or Russia, Ukraine, or things like that, of course you're going to feel it. Then the third element of the shock really is what I call, it's tied to the electoral cycle, right? So electoral shocks. And Priscilla talked again about this, where you tend to see a lot of out of control government spending that is really not tied into creating value for money or fundamentally transforming the structure of the economy. So if you have an economy that is still largely primary commodities, right, producing, but at the same time, you have this massive informal setup within it, and you've got the revenue issues, and then you add on top of that these big external shocks, then every couple of years, you're just going to end up going to the IMF for one support or the other. And the point is that these shocks, the external shocks, would always be there. I have argued that it's not even going to change. In the world that we live in now, we're going to have a lot more of these shocks. So fundamentally, then, it comes back to what we do from a structural point to turn the economy around. And this is where you see that we go into these IMF programs, we start implementing the reforms for a year or two, we get out, and then we're not able to sustain it going forward. But like I indicated, a lot of the answers, and I actually, again, recommend this book to our policymakers. They should go read this book because the answers are there. The Economy of Ghana 60 years after independence.
Interesting that you talk about this. Sometimes it is said that our people read all the source material, and the Institute for Statistical and Social and Economic Research, for example, ISA of the University of Ghana, comes out with a lot of these from time to time. The CDD has come out with similar documents. Sometimes you wonder whether they are even read. That is a question maybe for the gods. But let me bring in Professor Bafo Adjumandua, former UN Senior Governance Advisor, also CEO of the John Agyekum Kufuor Foundation. Thank you so much once more for joining the conversation. For you, from the governance end of things, yes, you can bring in the economics, but from the governance end of things, why do we keep getting here? Under former President Kufuor, we became HIPC. We saw some of the largest debt. Around that time in Africa, we were the second largest in terms of our debt to GDP forgiveness. The billions. We had a clean slate. After that, we've ended up at the doorstep of the IMF another 2-3 times. The question is, why? What is your take?
Well, thank you. And I'm glad my colleagues Theo and Priscilla have laid out their comments from the economist perspective. And you referring to President Kufuor, the HIPC and all, one thing we always forget is that he inherited a bankrupt economy in 2001. Nobody wants to go back to that era because those 11 years plus the additional 8 years under Jerry Rawlings really bankrupted the country. That's a naked fact. That's why Kufuor had to run to the IMF and together. But coming directly to your question, you see, from a different angle, I think it's easy for our leaders to go to the international market and borrow. It's so easy for them. So unfortunately, they tend to forget or they tend to think of how Ghana can become a truly independent country. Why do I say this? You see, Ghana has a very interesting history and a reputation, globally speaking. And oftentimes, the world or these countries that give us money have certain sympathy for Ghanaians. Secondly, they also know that the country is rich in mineral resources, and therefore we have a resource base that will make it possible for us to borrow, even though 17 times we borrowed and we find ourselves in a mess. Then I think, don't forget, Ghanaians are very good friends in most of these multilateral institutions, and including Ghanaians themselves who have risen to very high levels in these areas. So it's much easier for governments to contact their friends and get some money. Above all, I think creditors see loans as part of the global system to continuously enslave countries like Ghana. Okay? So if you put all this together, I think our leaders tend to be numbed by the easiness with which they can contract loans.
A very important point you made. Let me just take you up briefly on that. Are you saying then that the IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, are a disincentive for our leaders in terms of putting on their thinking caps and getting our economy running? You know, if you have only one Ghana cedi, and you know that one Ghana cedi is everything you have, You
That's
don't
right.
have options. You will not want to spend 3 Ghana cedis. In fact, you don't have it. You know, there's no manna coming from anywhere. So you would be constrained to work within those parameters. And that's how you build on. Are you saying our leaders have been spoiled by these Bretton Woods institutions and that actually they are a form of disincentive?
Well, you said it in your own way. I use the term numbed. Our brains are numbed because it's so easy for them to go and get the money. Because how come, look, the piece that you showed to the whole world yesterday, and I think some part of it this morning, we heard from our former president, Mahama, almost swearing an oath, this will be the last time we will go, right, to the IMF. We also saw the current finance minister and our president also saying we will never go, right? And we can go back into our history and recall instances where our leaders have made such pledges. But the question becomes, why do they continue to go? I can tell you that in the coming years, with this government or any other government, Ghana will go back to the IMF only because we are incapable of putting our house in order. Look, all the conditions that the IMF gave, and Theo was referring to it is a book, edited book. We know this. In fact, today we are going to sit here to repeat many of the things that we have said in the past. And if, I think you made an interesting point, whether our rulers read such books or such material. I believe they do. Or maybe if they do, they don't understand the issues. Because it's all clear. Whenever you go, they give you conditions. And we keep going the 17th time. So what is wrong with our thinking caps? For me, that is, you see, they refer to so many things. The fact is that the structure of our economy does not address the fundamentals of our existence. I know politicians always delighting in throwing figures at us. Oh, we had a growth of 7%, 3%. GDP is inflation goes. That's all they are using. But these are, for me, superficials. Because we know these things and they don't help us. Okay? The fundamentals are simply what Nana Akufo-Addo said when he was campaigning for office. The Gadgets-bed economy that we need to change. I think he said it so nicely. The Gadgets-bed economy. And I think Priscilla referred to that. That is to say, for 70 years or so, continuing to be what we call raw material export economy. For 70 years, we've not been able to kind of create any significant manufacturing base in the economy, right? For 70 years, and I like it when Priscilla said it, we don't have control over our natural resources. Recently, we all learned we have signed a contract for lithium. Lithium is one of the most strategic minerals in the world. The government has signed a contract. I have not seen it. Maybe through the Freedom of Information Act, we should all find what contains in that contract. But of course, the ministers also said recently that now they are going to process, they won't allow raw materials to be taken. And I applauded him for that. Let us see what it is.
Okay.
We allow our minerals to be taken out. In fact, yesterday also in the graphic, in the center spread, Mineral Development Fund, we have created that to build schools or boreholes in villages. I mean, I think the way we are managing ourselves is simply the problem. We are not getting, fortunately, we are not getting leaders with foresight. This problem cannot be tackled in 4 years. Neither can it be tackled in 8 years. We need to have a long-term vision. And that's what we don't see. Because the political system itself compels our leaders to try to show what they can within 4 years. And that's not possible. Lee Kuan Yew told the whole world in his book that there's no shortcut to development. There is no shortcut development. Development requires a strategy over a period of time and working consistently towards achieving results.
Interesting point you make, and it took them just about 30 years to move from a third world country to a first world country. So continuity, like we're seeing in some way. I know there are problems, but in some way in Rwanda, if you look at 1994 and what happened and where they are now, comparatively where we were and where we are now, you would see that our fortunes have been very different. But let me bring in Dr. Priscilla Twumasi-Bafo. I'm going to focus on you for just a little bit, about some 8 to 9 minutes so you can knock off. The first point, you made a point about tax regime. We've been talking about that this morning as well. What exactly is faulty with our tax regime? Because it appears we are overtaxing a certain sector and we are woefully undertaxing other aspects of the divide. Then again, there is the bit about the numerous taxes, like taxes slapped on sanitary products and all of that. How do we get our tax system right? And then secondly, tied to that, you spoke about abandoned projects, uncompleted projects. I think that is one major area. Throughout this Fourth Republic, there are roads we've been conducting or constructing for decades. Because one administration will start, it won't finish, the contractor will not go back to site. We have to re-award the contract and so many dynamics. Now, we have Agenda 111. People have raised concerns about feasibility, cost, whether we'll complete them and what happens to them. You remember the E-blocks. Then there is also the National Cathedral. How do you address these two issues, taxation and uncompleted projects? What do you see?
Thank you. Essentially, for the taxation, we see that because of it falls back to the structure of the economy. And so when you look at tax revenue with regards to whether it is direct taxes or indirect taxes, you find that for direct taxes, we do not do too well. And for direct taxes, you are looking at direct taxation of personal income taxes. I'm talking about income taxes. And the reason is that those in the formal sector constitute essentially about 25% of the labor force. And those are the people who pay direct taxes. And so you find that because we struggle to generate direct taxes from the majority of the labor market, which is the informal sector, our taxes are very heavy on indirect taxes. So the question you ask is, if we are not able to generate enough direct taxes through personal income taxes, what about other sources of direct taxes, such as a property tax, for example? So if somebody is working and making enough money and is not paying direct taxes because of the sector they are in, they would buy a property, so they live in homes. What about property taxes? Why can we not collect adequate property taxes to support the system, for example? Then there are other taxes. This government introduced luxury car tax, for example, that was taken out, I believe, essentially because of political issues. But we need to be very aggressive in terms of the collection of taxes, because a lot of the developed economies that we cite, they generate resources because governments do not do business. Government engine is oiled through revenue that is able to generate. And those revenues are mainly in our setting coming from taxes, given that we are not generating enough from our natural resources. Then you see that when it comes to the indirect taxes, that is where there is a lot of emphasis on, because you know that for indirect taxes, people cannot avoid the tax. So long as you consume a good, you pay VAT, for example. And when you look at taxes on petroleum products, there is a lot of taxes and levies that are put on there, because those are also sure avenues for the revenues to come in. The downside with being too heavy on indirect taxes is that indirect taxes disproportionately disadvantage the poor. And so why is that? If you put taxes on petroleum and then fuel prices go up, and transportation goes up, the people that are taking the trotro, that are paying the high trotro fare, it constitutes a significant part of their income. But certainly to those that are driving the luxury cars, those taxes, they do not tend to feel it much. And so consistently, you see that government introduced a COVID levy. And now they are appealing to us to bear with them, because essentially, when the levy is taken out, it creates a huge hole in government budgets. Where are they going to find resources to fill it? And it is all.
So are you suggesting? I mean, I've spoken to a number of analysts and experts. Are you suggesting the COVID-19 levy should stay until when? I would call it a nuisance levy as of this point in time, especially when even the World Health Organization has declared that we're out of a pandemic. Why do we still have it?
Certainly, I am not suggesting that it should stay. But if you look at the trajectory of taxation, the more the government succeeds in introducing a tax handle, it's very difficult for them to remove it. I mean, it will come in a different name, but certainly it is all because the way the structure is, it is difficult to get these things on. So once it comes in, you would find that at best, I'm sure I would not be surprised if, a name is given to the COVID levy, taken out of COVID, but probably some stabilization, something. And the point I am making is that because we are not generating enough, whenever a handle is placed in there and it becomes successful, it becomes very significant and difficult for government to take it out. So do not take me wrong at all. I am not advocating that it should be kept, but I'm indicating that it has become a significant source in the budget, and government will struggle in taking it out essentially. And so the point I am making is that when it comes to indirect taxes, that is where we are heavy on. And you indicated that the people that are in the tax nets are consistently being squeezed. That is true.
Right.
Because the people that are in the nets are the ones that are majority are paying the direct taxes. They are also paying indirect taxes. E-levy was introduced. They are the same people that are actively in there transacting electronic transactions.
Right.
So essentially, something needs to be done to broaden the tax base. We should adopt technology and rope a lot of people in through payment of taxes, whether direct or indirect. But for me, my advocacy is that GRA should go in and be very aggressive in terms of the collection of direct taxes as well, so that everybody contributes a bit to the nation that we are all seeking to develop. And then on condition that... So I have to come in, Doc, very quickly on this. We're constrained for time, unfortunately, so I'm going to constrain you to the next 2 minutes. I want you to do this for me. Address the issue with uncompleted projects. For example, what do you forecast with Agenda 111? Like Professor Binka has said, it's not feasible looking at the time. What do you forecast when it comes to the ratings agencies and basically what they've been saying, and our response, the president saying they have been reckless? Please address those two for me in 2 minutes, and we'll proceed from there. And then I can let go of you. I do not, based on the situation we are in, I do not think that Agenda 111 is something that the government would be able to accomplish, essentially. And then with regards to... And
the National Cathedral?
Rating, I have my doubts, certainly. I have not really studied the financial... what do we call it, the sources of finance for National Cathedral, but I know that they are raising some funds here and there. Certainly, if anything is coming from the public payers, it will be heavily challenged.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Doc, for joining us this morning. We know you are on a time leash, but we're grateful that you took the time to join us. Let me now bring in Dr. Richmond Etuahene. He is a banking consultant. Doc, a very good morning to you. Hello, Dr. Etuahene. Dr. Richmond Etuahene, please unmute so we can hear you.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure having you join the conversation. You're joining after we've already spoken about, the IMF dynamics and all of that. But I'd like to put this to you. Professor Agyemangua, who has joined the conversation, he's been with us from the start, has spoken about the fact that, in a way, we are too poor in our thinking and implementation because we know we can always fall on Big Brother IMF. So we become enslaved, in a way, in terms of our thinking and our actions. That is the first point. I want you reflecting on that. And then I want you to look at the ratings agencies. Interestingly, around 2020, 2021, when they were giving us a clean bill of health, we subscribed to what they were saying. But ever since last year, they started criticizing, using the same methodologies they had used in 2020 and 2021 to criticize us. Then we started crying wolf. Recently, the president said they had been reckless in how they had assessed us. What is the reality of that? Very briefly, sir.
Thank you, Ron. I think what Prof has said is just true as anything. I think we have, let me use it. Is it myopic minds or what? If you've been there a place for 17, 16 times and you cannot develop your own economy by yourself and you always want to look for 3 billion to support it. I mean, what Prof has just said, I think he's even used a weaker word. I would possibly use a very terrible word for us because we seem not to be understanding where we are and we don't know where we are going. Every time we like on borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, and we are not keeping that the export issues, develop the base where you have capacity. I mean, if I tell you, if you look at the BOP, the balance of payment, and you see the amount of gold, recently they say Ghana has been rated third, and you see the amount we get on it is peanut compared to South Africa. Why? Why can't we look at it, compare the resources of these gold retained on the BOP and the one that is taken over by these foreigners? So what Prof is saying is as true as anything, more than true that it's more than truth. I mean, I don't know what to say about what Prof has said. The way we think everything is about borrowing to consume instead of borrowing to do capacity building or where your competitive and comparative advantages are. It is when you are hit, then you come back and say that we're going to stop, we're going to cultivate rice, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. So what Prof Agyemangua is saying, I think for me, is fantastic. And Ghanaians to learn from what Prof has just said. And then on the rating, it's very sad, very, very sad. The very people who rated you to go to the market to borrow are now being called reckless. What is our, like Prof has just said, what's our way of thinking? And this methodology used is not only used for Ghana, it's used for like Cote d'Ivoire, it's used for Togo, it's used for Nigeria, it's used for every country. By the time you were seeking for money, you thought it was excellent. Now that you have run your economy down, mess it up, and somebody is just telling you that what you're doing is not right, we call them what? The comment, seriously, it's for me, it is just uncalled for. We should have kept our mouth shut and let the system find its own way. Because what we have done is not good for international image, international good. It's not good at all. So that is what I'll say, Ben.
Was there an alternative to the IMF program? We heard the likes of Seth Tekpe say that, look, we could dilly-dally, but once we came to that reality, we had to go there, which we did. We've also spoken about the issue of taxation. Some have said direct taxes, we may not be raking in enough from there. Indirect taxes, everyone pays them. But when you look at the mix, especially as you're considering the banking sector, are we making the right moves? What do we do to regulate the system, get more people in, and ease the burden on the precious few? What do you see in that regard?
I think from what the economics will tell you that if the production base is great, taxes will automatically come. Unfortunately, those who have been paying and overpaying. So instead of looking at the production, expanding your production capacity, and then expanding the net, we seem not to think about that. The GDP debt tax ratio is 12.7, and now we are projecting to 18 by putting more taxes on people who are paying. It means you're killing the economy. You're killing the domestic economy because they will be cash trapped and they won't have money to expand the business. And the private sector cannot also borrow. And that is going to affect even your, and now, let me even chip in. If you take the telecos and you took the mining, the next line on taxes was the financial sector, especially the banking. Now that you have almost collapsed it, where are you going to get those financial stability tax, where they are going to corporate tax, where you're going to get the physical tax? All these things are gone because we have been reckless in managing the economy. It's as simple as that. We have not managed ourselves.
So in other words, the president calls the downgrades from the institutions, basically calling the ratings agencies reckless themselves. But you are saying that we rather have been reckless in how we managed our economy.
There's no two ways about that. You go and borrow externally. Forgetting about that, you don't have control over your exchange rates. You only borrow to show the exchange rate. You didn't borrow to improve the capacity, expanding cocoa, expanding cashew, expanding pineapple, and what have you. You borrow to consume. And when you borrow to consume, you borrow to pay from your nose. So for me, it is not the rating agencies. It is very unfortunate. It's not the rating agencies. If we have borrowed to expand the capacity like cocoa, increase cocoa from 1 million tons to 3 million tons, today we will not be sitting here and talking like that.
Right.
If you look at the gold sector, if we have actually looked at our contracts very well, like the South Africans do, you don't sign contract by 70-30 when people are doing surface mining. When AGC used to do the deep mining, it wasn't like that. I have a time to look at it in those days. It was 60-40, but now people are scrapping the surface and doing 70-20. I don't know who signed the contract.
Right.
And they are ripping the economy. Ghana is, I'm told Ghana recently is the first. Ask us, how much did we get? It is not more than cocoa or anything, but we want to be proud of it. And I'm saying that, let us look internally. Let us take this mediocrity, cronyism. I mean, these are things that are killed. Let us look at the base of what the Far East did. They do that meritocracy. Meritocracy will build a country, not cronyism.
Okay.
You see, other than that, we are not, Professor Jambafo is a bit old, I'm a bit old. We will pass on. And what do we leave for the generation?
That is the question.
You and your great children. What are we leaving behind? Is that what the forefathers said we should do? No.
I love the passion with which you're speaking. And I hear a lot of senior citizens sounding same, saying that, Ben, you and your generation, you will come and inherit all the nonsense, all the recklessness, and what are you going to do with it? But as we wrap up the conversation, I'd like to come to you, Dr. Theo Champong, for 2 quick points, and then, gentlemen, we shall call it a wrap with your final comments. I'd like for us first to look at the state of our fiscal space currently. Ghana's fiscal position 11 months after the IMF program. What is your reading? And then again, as far as our external debt is concerned, we've dealt with the domestic debt situation with some little niggling bits. But experts are worried about the slow pace of process or proceedings in the external debt portfolio. In fact, Dr. Said Bwache of the Institute of Fiscal Studies has been pointing to that. What are your quick takes on these two matters before we wrap up?
Yeah, so quickly on the fiscal space, the fact is that we're still in debt distress, and I'm sure others have talked about this issue. And the money that we're getting from the IMF is only a small drop in the ocean compared to what we actually need to close the gap. So for the gap for this year, if you actually look at the IMF's own assessment and part of what Ghana is asking for, we've got a financing gap of $4.2 billion that we need to close. Out of that $4.2 billion, this year we're going to get $1.2 billion from the IMF. We've already gotten $600 million. The other $600 million likely around November if we meet the program conditionalities. But then we have as much as $2.5 billion that would have to get from the restructuring of our external debt. So that's about 65% of what we need to close the gap for this year alone has to come from the benevolence of, these creditors. And of course, they are also not Father Christmas. So we should expect some really hard negotiation in the weeks and months ahead. I have already indicated that I think would struggle a little bit in terms of getting some of those concessions, and the 2.4 billion that we're looking for, we may not get all of it at the moment. But the fundamental issues to address on the economy and what my other senior colleagues have talked about is, look, and I'll wrap up with my comments here. We've been fixated, and Professor Jambafo made this point, we've been fixated too much on macroeconomic indicators, right? So we keep talking inflation, we keep talking GDP, we keep talking all these things, but we're actually not connecting it to the micro level and the structural transformation that needs to take place. That's a very important point that we need to correct. The other point about the politics and the cycle is something that, again, we need to fundamentally address. And in terms of the transformation, my final point, again, I want to reference us to, there's another book that I've got here that I quickly will highlight. This is the Gold Coast Handbook, a book that was written in 1937. And in this book, cocoa farmers, just after the 1929-30 crash in the US, started complaining about the fact that they were not getting much for their cocoa produce, to the point that some of them even marched down on the colonial government in Accra to demand better prices and more value addition.
Right.
You can look or read this book and you can actually come to the point that almost 90 years or down the line, the same issues, we keep talking about them, and the structural transformation is not happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. Prof, my sincere apologies, Professor Bafo Agyeman-Duah. I have to constrain you to a maximum of about 30 seconds for your wrap-up. This would have wanted a bit more of a flow, but we are constrained. So please, what would be your final comments for us, Prof?
My final comment is just like Theo is doing, taking us back to history. Ghanaians do not learn our history. Look, there was a period in our recent history where the government never went to the IMF, 1972 to 78, Kutu Echampong. Despite all his failures, and I know he made some terrible mistakes, he never went to the IMF. And ask yourself why. Because of the domestic policies he initiated. Operation Feed Yourself, Operation Feed Your Industry, seeking 50% shares in our minerals in this country.
But today, while we are constrained for time, I just have to say this. Today, you can't go and say Yentia.
You cannot say Yentia, but you can do like my good friend Tuahin was saying. You sign contracts today like you signed it 30 years ago. Look, currently, Namibia has started renegotiating with companies that have been mining their minerals over the years. So we need some courage. We need some leaders with vision who can project where we want to be. Not these ad hoc promises that I heard somebody say his vision is to make Ghana a digital hub. Upon what basis? If your fundamentals are weak, then you create a digital empire. Where will it stand? Vision, 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 courage.
Thank you for joining the conversation. All of you for contributing. We had earlier Dr. Priscilla Chumesi Bafo, Senior Lecturer, Department of Economics at the University of Ghana. You just had Professor Bafo Agyeman-Duah, CEO, J. Kufuor Foundation. There's also Dr. Theo Echampong, economist and political risk analyst, Dr. Richmond Etuahene, a banking consultant. We're so grateful that you took the time to join us this morning.